Greetings, everyone. My name is Christopher Martin, and I'm pleased to be serving as the interviewer for our Fireside chat portion of the Mobile World Congress Shanghai's discussion around 5G security. We'll be discussing threat-centric cybersecurity, protecting the array of 5G technologies with Joshua McCloud from Cisco and Peter Allwood from MasterCard. I'll let our speakers introduce themselves briefly, and then we'll dive right into the discussion. Joshua, what's your role at Cisco?
Thank you, Chris, and good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I work in Cisco's Security and Trust organization. We're responsible for three key things: protecting Cisco's enterprise business operations, protecting our products in terms of trust and integrity, and then working with governments and enterprises around the world to ensure that their cyber defenses are as strong as possible.
Thanks, Joshua. Peter?
Thanks. So it's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation. So I'm Peter Allwood. I'm Vice President of Technology Innovation and Strategy in MasterCard's Cyber Intelligence Solutions Group. CNI, as we call it, offers integrated products and services to prevent, detect, and respond to fraud and cyber attacks, and to ensure the safety of transactions made using MasterCard's products.
Thanks, Peter. So, gentlemen, let me start with a little bit of scene setting. Many countries are in the race to roll out 5G, and some of the world's leaders are right here in Asia, heavily investing in the rollout of 5G infrastructure and the technologies that go alongside those. But the dilemma of increasing connectivity is that these networks are also increasingly vulnerable to cyber attack. So amplifying that heightened threat environment to all the new network connections and all the applications that 5G will enable, there are inevitably new risks to take into account. With that backdrop, what do you think is lacking in terms of security? Maybe Joshua, from your vantage point at Cisco, I'll ask you to kick into the discussion.
Yeah, I'm very happy to comment on this. So I think one thing to keep in perspective is that 5G is susceptible to many of the same cybersecurity risks found in today's existing telecommunications and enterprise networks. But it's also subject to new avenues of attack against core network services that comprise the 5G infrastructure. This is largely due to the more complex ecosystem of technologies and operations that really are what make 5G what it is. While not exhaustive, there are three key risk areas that are particular to 5G. First one I would call out is the service-based architecture of 5G. So 5G is based on a decomposed, virtualized, distributed network set of network functions. And as a result, this exposes new points of attack, and it can lead to challenges in managing security controls. Two, API-based communications. So 5G leverages APIs to enable communications between these service functions that form up the core of 5G. If these are poorly coded or insecure because they have not been, ultimately locked down to prevent access, then this can expose these core services to attack and ultimately place the entire 5G network at risk. And the third point I would make is around the enterprise, industrial, and IoT services that are going to be provided by 5G. So as 5G expands to include advanced enterprise, industrial, and IoT use cases, breaches can ultimately put critical infrastructure services rather than just consumer mobile devices at greater risk. What I would suggest is to think about in terms of addressing these risks is, first of all, countries need to set the cybersecurity bar higher and establish a level of accountability for implementing robust processes and controls. Against that backdrop, I would offer three key recommendations. And again, these are not exhaustive. One, it's important to adopt a zero trust framework. So by limiting access rights, authorizing all interactions, partitioning assets through microsegmentation, and then continuously monitoring security posture, we can significantly reduce the attack surface. Second point I would say is to ensure that vendor trust and integrity is there. By validating vendor supply chain security and secure development practices and leveraging trustworthy components, we can ultimately reduce the risk of backdoors and tampering. And certainly we've seen some of this in recent months. And the third point I would offer is to implement comprehensive threat protection. Go beyond defensive security controls and really think about continuous monitoring and response operations. Harness machine learning capabilities, because at this scale, you really need a level of automation to address it. With all of that in place, I think we can really help limit the likelihood and the potential impact of attacks against 5G.
Thanks, Joshua. That's an interesting introduction to some of those key risks. Peter, what's your perspective on that?
For me, there really are three big implications to consider as 5G changes the world. The speed of 5G connections, obviously, much faster. It's going to allow consumers and businesses to connect. Then there's this huge growth that Joshua was talking about of IoT devices, and the reports are saying this could be between 50 billion and 75 billion in the next 5 years. But the thing here is that most of these devices are going to be dependent on really, really reliable connections, which 5G is going to bring to the world. And this together is going to bring an explosion of data. Again, in 5 years' time, we're expecting over 70 zettabytes of information that's going to be generated by this ecosystem. And when you add all that together, as Joshua said, I think there are quite a few areas that we need to consider and think about. The network, the infrastructure, and the devices. And just to pick on a few examples there, within the network, we're seeing more and more automated botnet attacks, leveraging other devices to create denial of service attacks. We've seen this a few years ago when the Mirai botnet. But this is only going to get worse and worse and worse. So we need to think very carefully about how can we embed this capability within that network infrastructure stack. The second point is that back-end infrastructure and the software that's running. There's a lot of virtualization technology, which Joshua hinted at. There's malware that's just going to be designed custom for those 5G systems. These new strains of malware are going to understand how those 5G networks work and exploit them and take advantage of services like network slicing. So we're going to need to be aware of malware which is designed for 5G and is 5G aware, and ultimately be aware of the software vulnerabilities which are going to start to be exposed in this infrastructure. And then lastly, the devices themselves, whether it's mobile, wearables, or IoT, we need to think about ransomware is increasing, and actually ransomware will become more prevalent. Rather than just asking for money so you can't access your laptop, suddenly ransomware is going to stop us accessing physical services, things that consumers can use, things that businesses can use. Hopefully in the future we're not locked out of our car because of ransomware, which is really attacking connected devices. And underlying all of that for those devices, we need to think about compliance to security standards. So I think 5G is really unlocking an explosion of problems, but also opportunity in the security world.
Well, I think that's a great way to get a handle a bit about the scale of the challenge. But 5G isn't just infrastructure, it's applications. Can we delve a bit into that?
So yeah, this is something that we're really starting to look at as we evolve from in-person payments and online payments in e-commerce. This is moving to payments which can be less consumer initiated and more initiated by devices. And then payments in person are becoming more flexible and moving from a card or a mobile into wearables and ultimately to deviceless and biometric payments. So this evolution, again, matches with that explosion of devices in the ecosystem. And what we're seeing is that devices ultimately will become more autonomous and start to make decisions on behalf of the consumer. We'll have delegated authentication and delegated permissions for devices to make transactions. Again, when we think about those 5G connected devices and IoT, they'll take in real-time data from sensors. So a couple of areas that we're starting to be interested in from a consumer perspective for MasterCard are the smart home. What's happening in the smart home? Which new smart home appliances are going to come through and really start to make a difference? I think we all have more and more connected devices in our smart homes today. I know I have, that are listening in, they're providing security, they're doing all sorts of things to enrich our lives and make things easier. I think that's only going to continue. So we're starting to think about those appliances, that fridge, can that fridge start to replenish itself automatically in order? With COVID, everybody is at home and there are a lot of lockdowns around the world. So online ordering has become a real thing. There's less and less interaction in physical stores. So that, this is another opportunity for automation to come in and leverage the 5G connectivity in the home. We also see that another area where this is becoming bigger is in connected car and the connected and autonomous vehicle. As those vehicles become more intelligent, they're going to start to become a commerce hub that could pay for charging, could pay for servicing, parking and tolls. I think some of these use cases are already in existence, but actually they differ in many areas of the world. And ultimately, when we move towards autonomous, the vehicle themselves could do autonomous journeys. Again, really harnessing the 5G, interacting with other vehicles, and trust there is obviously safety, not just payments. So there's a number of things we're trying to do. And firstly, building on Joshua's point, zero trust framework. We need to make sure every transaction stays secure. The second thing is defining this future of secure and IoT autonomous payments. We need to make sure that the payment credentials are always accessible to that device, that they're in the cloud, they're intelligent, because not every device needs to have credentials provisioned, like a card or a mobile or a wearable. We also need to ensure that fraud is reduced, and even disputes in transactions. Today we can dispute a transaction with our bank, but it becomes a little bit trickier if we could disputing a transaction that was made by a device on our behalf. So all of these sort of issues blend together, and 5G is powering it. And lastly, just 2 points. The identity piece is going to become much more important. In MasterCard, we've been thinking about consumer digital identity, but actually we're expanding that into thinking about the identity of accounts and the identity of devices, because these things all need to link together so we can apply machine learning and AI to really ensure the power of our fraud systems continue to work in this connected world. And lastly, experience. I think we need to make sure that experience is as good as ever, because the more complex this environment gets, the more security controls that come in. We need to make sure some of those are visible and invisible, and they keep the ecosystem secure.
Thanks, Peter. Curious, Joshua, what's your perspective on how these applications are starting to play out in the world?
First of all, I want to say that I love the future that we are already experiencing with mobile payments and using our devices anywhere. But I did want to pick up on this point of IoT devices and security. One of the challenges we face in securing 5G applications that leverage IoT devices, particular autonomous ones, and particularly in the industrial space, is identifying and authorizing those devices. So to say, how do we validate what the device is, what access rights it should be granted, do it automatically, and then do it at scale, which is what we're really talking about in this environment. Hundreds of thousands of devices, billions that ultimately Peter talked about. So one key standard that we're seeing gain some traction and adoption out there is known as manufacturer usage descriptions, or MUD. The idea is that leveraging a manufacturer embedded certificate, the IoT device, it would be inside the IoT device, the device can identify itself to the network. It can say what class of device it is, what model, and then the 5G network and the application services interacting with that network can dynamically apply a corresponding access control policy. So 5G services can, for example, learn the difference between an insulin pump and a temperature sensor, dynamically apply and enforce microsegmentation rules that restrict communication so that the insulin pump only talks to the medical application and the temperature sensor only to the HVAC application. And then in both of those circumstances, ensure the policy uses the least privileges required. So identity really links in to authorization, to access control, and that's what we've got to get better at doing. And so there are a number of standards that are helping us do that. But I think as we see those autonomous devices become more widely adopted out there, the importance of this aspect is only going to grow.
Yeah, the health sector is, I think, ripe for this type of innovation, this security innovation. But I did want to ask you both where you just see the discussion progressing, and are there any immediate recommendations you might make to tackle some of these 5G security challenges, or questions you think that are important to ask and ponder more so that we can better adapt our businesses and organizations and even the governance around 5G? Josh?
Yeah, maybe I could jump in on this. I actually wanted to come back to the point around trust and integrity, particularly as it applies to 5G. As we've seen, unfortunately, with the recent SolarWind attacks, and then before that, NotPetya, before that, CCleaner, I think some people think that just because this is the most recent attack, this is suddenly a threat vector that is new. It's actually one that's been around for a little while. And we see that these supply chain attacks are real and have significant consequences. So I think in the context of 5G, more than anywhere else, it's important to leverage trustworthy components and vendors as a foundation for 5G cybersecurity. I would advocate that 5G operators and government regulators take a close look at how 5G vendors, first of all, protect their own enterprise environment from attack, because in many ways, that's the first stage of any threat, is the ecosystem that the 5G infrastructure depends on. Look at how they secure their sensitive intellectual property, how they maintain a robust, secure development lifecycle, and then protect that entire supply chain from development to delivery to implementation and ultimately scrap. And then how do 5G operators and government regulators continuously monitor the trustworthy status of that infrastructure? I think without this fundamental level of trust and integrity in vendors and components, ultimately the entire 5G security stack can crumble. So that's my key takeaway there.
I can hear other hardware manufacturers and actually just all businesses that have actually taken the time and resources to really invest in their own security architecture understand that same sentiment around the importance of the foundation and how those vendors' commitment to security is so important. Peter, any final thoughts?
It's really about security by design. This is what we have to build in. I think this is what really Joshua is describing. It's end to end. It's that zero trust framework that I think we both touched on at the beginning. Ultimately, underneath that though is standards, and standardization is key. Standardization in payments is critical. We're allowing different players to interact with each other. Technologies need to do the same thing globally. That watch, that card that we talked about needs to work the same way everywhere, giving the same level of security. That applies in 5G, that applies in IoT. So really leveraging these standards, and again, building on what Joshua said, authentication is really important now. Device security, the work that organizations like the FIDO Alliance are doing are really important for us to think about. How can we verify users? How can we use biometric technology? How can we bind users and devices together? So in this 5G world, there is that core trust element. And as that moves forward, we are starting to really see a shift from probabilistic identity. So we're trying to determine the identity based on data towards more deterministic identity, which is leveraging the security of certificates, cryptography, which again, building on Joshua's point, is built into some of these devices so that a device is trusted because it has a secure chip, it has a certificate built in. And then lastly, I think I would just add that the really important thing here, as we've talked about the explosion of devices, data, the speed of networks, is vulnerabilities and reporting. We know that a lot of the big attacks, the events, SolarWinds, NotPetya, others, they always start with some sort of vulnerability. Yes, there's an attack tool which is used, but in the 5G world, with this expanded footprint of devices, there's going to be an increasing number of vulnerabilities that are identified. And then the interesting thing there is there's a connection between these vulnerabilities and more interdependencies between different systems, applications and services. Ultimately, all of these pieces together, we're going to have to work much better between different organizations, governments, standards bodies to think of a way of how we can identify vulnerabilities. This is something that we do in MasterCard with our risk recon acquisition, helping identify vulnerabilities in the payment ecosystem. But when we think about IoT, how are we going to do that globally as an industry? And then how are we going to start to report those and address them? And also think about how they affect each other. I think that's going to become really important as this world grows.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Joshua, both you gentlemen, for a short but I'd say very interesting and indeed fascinating exploration of some of the risks that the 5G security environment is facing and some of the real innovations and ways in which companies and organizations are tackling these. With that, I'm going to bring our session to a close. Thank you again for your time, and look forward to a future session at another Mobile World Congress Shanghai. Thanks so much.